You may proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Samuels.
Good morning.
All right, I wanted to begin our discussion today about amnesia.
Okay.
I know we talked a little bit about it last week, but I have some things I want to clear up with you.
Sure.
Can we talk first about transient global amnesia?
Yes.
Can you tell us what that is?
Well, it's a type of amnesia that can occur with a relatively modest stimulus. It may last for a short period of time, somewhat longer. Usually it's not permanent. There are numerous things that can bring it about, apparently.
All right. Last week we showed on the slide something that an article. It was a review article, I believe.
Yes.
And in that review article, it talked about some of the different things that can cause transient global amnesia.
Yes.
Can you first tell us what's a review article?
That particular article, a review article, is one where the authors go to the bother of doing a global research on a particular area. They read all of these articles. They synthesize some conclusions from those articles, and then they write a summary article, which is what I read.
So you read the summary article?
I read the summary article. There were 119 articles that were reviewed in there.
All right. And in that summary article, did it talk about some of the things that can cause transient global amnesia?
Yes.
And on the slide last week, one of the slides talked about things like being immersed in hot water or cold water.
Yes.
Can that really cause transient global amnesia?
Well, apparently it can. These were documented from patient reports and other examinations of cases that appeared in the archives of people who study these things.
All right. And so what's the point of talking about transient global amnesia?
Well, I wanted to point out to the jury that amnesia is not necessarily a fake or made-up kind of experience. It occurs fairly commonly in the population, 3 to 8%, or 3 to 8% of every 100,000 cases. So 3 to 8% of every 100,000 cases. It's a small percentage, but the fact of the matter is that it's regularly reported, and so it is not as if amnesia can only be made up as to cover up something.
And now, is this transient global amnesia, what we're talking about right now, that can be caused by some, would you characterize them as minor type? Relatively
minor.
And these relatively minor type actions like immersion in hot water or cold water, is the basis for the amnesia is because it's a shock?
Probably so.
Okay.
The etiology is not completely understood.
All right. And when I say shock, I'm saying like shock to the system, the person?
Yes, a shock to the system.
Okay. Is that something that Jodi suffers from?
No.
And what is it that you would say that Jodi, what type of amnesia does she have?
The type of amnesia that she...
Rule 703, 702, ultimate issue.
Just may we approach?
You may.
All right, Dr. Samuels, before we get to talking so much about Jodi, let's talk a little bit more about dissociative amnesia. Can you tell us what it is?
Dissociative amnesia is a form of amnesia. There are several different types of amnesia, but this is a form of amnesia that appears to be based upon the fact that memories were not initially established due to an interference with the hippocampus. And it usually has a specific beginning and a specific end or period of time when memories are not being formed. And the individual cannot retrieve memories for that period of time.
Judge may approach?
Yes.
Dr. Samuels, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 529. Do you recognize that?
I do.
Okay. Is that a picture of the brain that we used last week?
Yes.
Slide?
Yes.
All right. And does this help you to explain when we're talking about the hippocampus and the different parts of the brain that are affected during acute stress and causing this dissociative amnesia?
Yes.
Judge Defense would move in Exhibit 529.
On that from last week, it's motion for reconsideration. I would ask that it be denied.
Judge, may we approach?
Yeah, approach, please.
All right, Dr. Samuels, here's the picture of the brain that we looked at. Oops. Okay, so you were discussing what happens when somebody goes into acute stress, which then can cause dissociative amnesia. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us then the acute stress, what is happening in the brain?
Well, signals first flow into the amygdala, which is the seat of emotion. And that, in turn, places the body in a fight or flight situation if there is a threat. That produces a flood of adrenaline, a constriction of peripheral capillaries to reduce the likelihood of bleeding out if you're attacked, increases the blood pressure, increases the awareness of the surroundings. It also tends to shut down the gray matter, or it's actually sort of yellowish matter up there, the area that surrounds the brain, which is generally thought to be responsible for our executive capabilities, our thinking, our creativity, and so on. The purpose of that reaction occurring is to save the life of the individual who's under threat. The chemicals also have a negative impact on the hippocampus, which is that light green area adjacent to the blue area, which is the amygdala. Yes, that's it. The hippocampus is the seat of memory. Without a properly functioning hippocampus, memories are not formed and are not coded into long-term memory. Now, long-term memory does not reside in the hippocampus, but instead is somehow, we're not sure, coded into the protein, we think, of the general brain, which is why if a person has a brain injury to relatively small area of the brain, they still have memories. It's not as if they lose certain memories due to an accident like that. It's sort of a redundancy that's built into the coding. And so if a memory is not formed, we call that the inability to remember those things amnesia. Now, dissociative amnesia is usually associated with criminal behavior. And according to the research, the more intense the trauma, the more likely and the more complete the amnesia. The amnesia has a finite period, rather the loss of memory covers a finite period of time, usually as long as the stressful situation is occurring. Perhaps I could draw a diagram.
Would that make it easier to explain?
I think it might be easier if I could just show that.
Sure.
I'll hand this to you, obviously. Okay.
Did you initial it?
Oh, sure. Okay.
May I approach, Judge?
I'm not a good artist here, so.
Hi, Dr. Sanders. You drew us a diagram. It's been marked for identification as Exhibit 530. And the diagram, how does it help you explain what we're talking about?
Basically, what it does is that it shows the function of normal memory and then interference with the capacity to remember, which produces a decline in the ability to store memories, and then a gradual return to more normal memory development.
All right. Judge's defense would move to enter Exhibit 530 into evidence.
No.
530 is admitted.
Okay.
All
If you
right.
start off on the left-hand side.
All right. You can actually touch your screen if you want to.
Oh, great. Okay, terrific. So we have a memory. This is a memory function. Now, this is very arbitrary and pictorial. This is not exactly what goes on in the brain, but this is the easiest way to describe it. Our capacity for memory, let's say it's 100%. That doesn't look like 100% at all, but okay, say that's 100%. Until a trauma or stressful situation occurs. At that point, the chemicals start flooding into the hippocampus, interfering with its ability to store memories, and the capacity for memory begins to decline until it reaches some lower level. When the stressful situation is over, or the person is removed from the circumstances that create the stress, the chemicals stop flowing into the hippocampus. They are eventually washed out by other chemicals, and the capacity for the hippocampus to create new memories begins to return. And you can see a gradual increase. Now, this increase is not necessarily complete. It's not 100%. It's not like it was a light switch, one moment on, one moment off, and then on again. But it's a gradual and fairly sloppy return. That represents the loss of memory that we refer to as dissociative amnesia.
And when somebody has this loss of memory, when they're down here at the bottom of the scale or bottom of your drawing, do those memories, do they ever come back?
If they're not there, they can't come back. They're simply not there. Now, what might happen is that it's possible that in the course of this, there are slight hills and valleys within this loss of capacity. So flashes of events may be vaguely remembered, but there's no way of knowing in advance whether that's going to happen. But the key is either all of the memory or the bulk of the memory is lost. And indeed, dissociative amnesia is associated with crimes that occur in a state of extreme emotional circumstances. And the more intense the crime or intense the distress, the more complete the amnesia tends to be.
And when you say more complete, what do you mean?
The loss is greater. The loss is more permanent. Most of what's occurred is not remembered, as opposed to perhaps some of it being remembered.
All right. Now, last week you said that you had met with Miss Arias several times. Is that
Yes.
right? About how many times did you meet with her?
I think we met about 12 times.
And do you have an idea about how many hours you spent with her?
Probably between 25 and 30 hours all told. But that did not include the time that I took to test her. I didn't add that time in.
Oh, okay. So 25 or 30 hours of just speaking with her.
Speaking with her.
And then additional time when you did the testing.
That's right.
During that time, did you discuss, did she talk to you about what happened and what she could remember?
Yes. Well, the first few times I met with her, as I mentioned, Thursday. I guess it was Thursday?
Thursday.
Thursday, okay. She did not reveal what actually happened. She was telling this story about intruders. I think that's...
His characterization of what really happened. He's now vouching. He can tell us what she told him, but...
Sustained.
Go ahead. You can continue.
Okay. So that was the story that she was telling me. And at some point, Mr. Nurmi and I went to visit her, and we encouraged her to reveal the truth. And finally...
I don't object to his characterization. It's a change in story. He can't say it's the truth.
Sustained.
Okay, I understand it.
We're
I
talking
understand.
about what...
She changed her story and admitted to us that she had done the killing.
Okay. And then after that point in time, did you discuss with her what had happened and the points that she remembered?
Yes.
And did you discuss with her the points, the gap in time that she did not remember?
She remembered, and this was fairly consistent in the numerous times that I asked her this, because part of the examination process is to bring up the same area in several different ways. So it seemed pretty consistent to me that she remembered the point when she dropped the camera. Mr. Alexander, according to her story...
Again, I would object. He's saying it was consistent, and again, he's vouching. He can tell what the stories are. He just can't tell us.
Sustained.
May I, Judge? With regard to the...
Approach, please. You may continue.
Okay. Dr. Samuels, you talked about the consistency. So when you're talking about that, that has to do with what she remembers? In other words, when she's talking to you on different occasions, is she reporting to you that she's remembering the same things?
Yes.
Okay. So is she consistent in that manner to you?
Yes.
And the gaps that she does not remember, are those gaps, have they been consistent with you?
Yes.
And where her memory picks up again, has her memories with regard to where it picks up again, has that been consistent?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So when you're speaking with Miss Arias about these things, does it ultimately lead you to a conclusion about what the type of amnesia she might have?
Yes.
And what is that?
It appears as if she suffers from dissociative amnesia.
All right. And that's what we were just talking about here, right, with the memory function and the time?
That's correct. This area here is the period of dissociation.
Okay.
And I might point out
Yes.
that the beginnings, such as here, and the ends tend to be foggy and hazy, and that's classically how it goes, because as the memory function is either gradually deteriorating or gradually being restored, memories can begin to occur, but oftentimes they're reported as being foggy or fuzzy.
Okay. And so the foggy or hazy memory is occurring as the brain is going into the complete loss?
Yes.
And as the brain's climbing out of the complete loss, it's also foggy and hazy?
Yes.
Okay. All right, and with dissociative amnesia, are there ever a chance of pieces of memory coming?
Sometimes bits and pieces.
Overruled.
Go ahead.
Sometimes bits and pieces of memory can be retrieved. I have done a good deal of hypnosis work looking for restored memories with police departments of officers who were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. It is generally not too effective. Very rarely some piece of detail will be recalled, but it's rarely productive.
All right, and is that ultimately, I'm showing you exhibit number 529, is that ultimately because there is no memories stored in the gray matter from the traumatic event?
That's correct. The memory has never been encoded into a form that the brain can store long term.
Okay.
And once gone, it's gone.
Okay. Now, we talked, one of the criteria for post-traumatic stress was intrusive thoughts.
Yes.
Is that right? And intrusive thoughts are what?
These are thoughts usually about the trauma that pop up into the actors or the individual understudies thinking. They can't control it. They come in sort of random times. Sometimes it may be at night, sometimes in the morning. Sometimes they may hear something that triggers an intrusive thought, but those are what we call intrusive thoughts.
All right, and did Miss Arias suffer from intrusive thoughts?
Yes.
Well, let me ask you, how can that be if she doesn't remember a big gap of what happened?
The intrusive thoughts that were referred to me, that were mentioned to me, involve the beginning of this traumatic event. She recalled herself being chased.
Object on the grounds of vouching.
She reported remembering that he was threatening her life. And then at the end, she began to remember becoming reconnected to her environment while on that road in Arizona covered with blood. That's the end, the other part of the intrusive memories. So the intrusive memories appear to be those that occurred at the very beginning of this trauma and as she was coming out of that hours later. So those were the intrusive memories that were repeated to me.
All right, and so are those things that pop up into her memory without control?
Yes.
And is that what makes them intrusive?
Yes, because you can't really control them. They just pop up.
Okay. I forgot to ask you last week, with regard to, when we're talking about your education and work and profession, are there, with regard to psychology and medical doctors, are there complaints that can be made?
Yes, complaints can be made to the examination board by just about anyone, actually.
And is there a specific area where doctors receive complaints more often than others?
Well, obviously it depends on your specialty, but in the field of psychology, complaints tend to cluster around custody disputes, and indeed that did happen to me once.
Lack of foundation, how he knows that these complaints are clustered in that area?
Sustained.
Well, Judge, he just was finishing a sentence where he said he knows that because it happened to him.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
Dr. Samuels, do you know other psychologists?
I know psychologists. I know people who are members of the board. I read the board listings, and it is very clear and well known.
Well, before you say that.
Yes.
Knowing knowing the other doctors that you know, and you said you read the board listings?
The board of psychology produces, well, they used to do newsletters, now it's on the internet, indicating board actions against certain people.
And is there a general thought that complaints against doctors occur in more areas, different areas than others, more
Yeah.
often in a different area.
Yes.
And do you know that based on the fact that you know all these different doctors and you read these other publications?
Yes, and it's commonly discussed amongst professionals.
Okay. And what is that area?
Custody evaluations.
Okay. And in custody evaluations, do you have an idea as to why this is something that is ripe for complaints?
Objection, relevance, lack of foundation.
Approach, please. You may proceed.
Okay, Dr. Samuels, generally speaking, in your area with regard to custody situations, is that something that has issues with it with regard to getting complaints? Doctors, you or other doctors in that area?
Well, sure, there's always one winner and one loser in custody evaluations. So invariably, you're only satisfying 50% of your clientele. And so those types of complaints are not at all uncommon.
And did you ever have a complaint against you?
I did.
Could you tell us when that was?
Yes, it involved a 1994 or 1995 custody evaluation that I was asked to conduct. It was an extraordinarily acrimonious divorce. There were multiple lawsuits between partners, attorneys, psychologists, psychiatrists. It was a big mess.
What was your role in it?
My role initially was to be the joint custody evaluator. The gentleman came to see me, and I tested him and evaluated him, saw him with his children and so on, but the mother refused to attend. His attorney asked me instead to provide a letter to her office indicating whether or not I viewed him as a competent parent. I did, but it was not a full-fledged custody evaluation because I never evaluated the woman.
Okay.
I was then told that this was no longer a case of custody and that the only issue was visitation. About 4 weeks later, the wife calls my office and asks to make an appointment. I call the attorney of this gentleman and tell him that she's finally come in. She asks me to please test her, but that the evidence and information would not be used in a custody determination because I was no longer doing custody. I explained that to the woman who decided to come in with her children, and I observed her. And I made the observation that she too was a competent parent, no contraindications to either one of them parenting the children.
Did you ultimately testify in that case?
I did not testify as a custody person. I
Okay.
did not testify as a custody evaluator. The gentleman then called me up in tears, begging me to see him as a patient because he was having terrible troubles. His business went bankrupt. His wife, of course, they had split. He was having tremendous financial problems. He was a dentist. And he asked me to see him for therapy.
Now, are you allowed to do that when you're a custody evaluator?
Well, I formally contacted his attorney and I resigned as custody evaluator. And I stated that I would not testify as a custody evaluator. And since custody was no longer the issue, I felt appropriate with that. And of course, I obtained letters from the attorney releasing me from that role and so on. So I started seeing this gentleman. And at some point, he owed me a good deal of money, and he told me that he was going bankrupt. He had no money. And he offered, because he wanted to continue seeing me, for me to see him. And I had looked in the American Psychological Association ethical guidelines, and it said that bartering was permitted as long as it did not, what was the terminology? Did not compromise the relationship. So professional to professional was perfectly fine, which is what we did.
Okay.
And somewhere down the line, I went to court to testify only as to his mental state, because he was now a patient, and that the condition he was suffering from, which was an anxiety disorder and some depression, would not impede his ability to spend visitation time with his children.
All right. And so at the point that you're testifying down the line, you weren't supposed to be for the husband and the wife
That's
together.
right. At this point, I was simply I testified as a therapist.
Okay.
And there are other complications, but I won't go into it. At any rate, about a year later, a complaint was filed to the New Jersey Board of Psychological Examiners, And they brought up this case, and part of the case involved the fact that I bartered. Now, unbeknownst to me, New Jersey passed a ruling that did not permit bartering as part of the psychological guidelines. There was a 3-month overlap between the time that I started bartering with him, which was permitted nationally, but not permitted by the state. So
Let me just get that straight. So in the beginning, when you were going to him as a dentist,
right,
that was okay.
that was okay.
But there was 3 months that you were continuing to see him as a dentist, and that New Jersey had changed the
New
rules.
Jersey had changed the ruling, and I was not made aware. I didn't know that. They may have sent out a bulletin, and there was no internet in those days, so they may have sent out a bulletin. I may have missed it. I wasn't unaware of it. At any rate, the wife and her attorney boyfriend found some records that we had done this exchange, and decided to file a complaint that I was bartering inappropriately. The New Jersey board examined this material and decided to fine me $2,500 for having done that. And no license was taken away, nothing was suspended, just the fine. The next step was that in psychology and in the field of medicine, if someone makes a complaint to one board, every board that you're on is notified, so they can do their own independent examinations. Letter went out to the American Psychological Association, in which I am a fellow of 2 divisions, and they decided not to take it up. It was trivial. The American Board of Professional Psychology, where I'm a diplomate, decided not to take it up. The Arizona Board, 2 years later, decided to take it up, and I was exonerated in a vote of 13-0, and the complaint was dismissed. And that was the one and only time in dealing with thousands of patients, at least over 1,000 evaluations, that anyone ever lodged a complaint. And as I said, both the attorney and the psychiatrist involved in the case were also complained about by this particular party.
So you weren't the only one who got a complaint from this lady?
No, it was a messy case.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And so is that what you mean by custody? Do you do custody evaluations
No,
anymore?
after that I decided not to do custody evaluations anymore. It just didn't pay.
Okay. All right. You talked, well, besides working with the phenomenon of PTSD quite a bit, you had mentioned earlier that you also work with sexually violent perpetrators and have done psychosexual risk assessments?
Yes, when coming to Arizona in 1988, 89 or thereabouts, Arizona had passed a new law called the Sexually Violent...
Yes. We're going to take the noon recess at this time. Please be back in the designated area at 1:25. Please remember the admonition. You are excused.
Please stand for the jury.
The record will show the jury has left the courtroom. Dr. Samuels, you may step down. We are in recess until 1:25. Counsel, I will see you in chambers.